Yes, I think we are live now. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another special session of Carvan, the Heritage Exploration Initiative. And we have a very special guest, Professor T.K.V. Subramanian, sir, retired from Delhi University, Department of History. And today is going to speak about maybe a colleague of his and a great historian of our times and a legend in history writing, Burton Steen. And Burton Steen was an American historian whose area of specialization was India. And Steen's contribution as a research scholar were mainly focused on pre-modern or colonial South India. And he spent the early 60s formulating a hypothesis about the nature of state in South India. He was skeptical of the existence of a system of bureaucracy in the Chola dynasty, and he delved into the theory of tribal society and referred to the work of Aidan Southall, The Illusion of Tribe. And he published his first book, Peasant State and Society in Medieval South India in 1980s, with the theme of segmentary lineage. Today's speaker, Professor T.K.V. Subramaniam, was born in the year 1947 in Tirunelveli district of Tamil Nadu, and he completed his MA from Presidency College Madras in 1968 and was awarded the doctorate in history from Madras University in 79. After having served as an assistant professor and professor under Tamil Nadu Collegiate Education Service at the postgraduate level from 71 to 84, he joined Delhi University as a reader in 1984 and became a professor in 1994. With a teaching and research experience for more than 41 years, Professor Subramaniam has made significant contribution to the discipline of history, and today he's going to speak about Burton Steen, a historian at work. So without further ado, I would like to ask Professor Subramanian to take forward the proceedings. Over to you, sir.
Good evening, Ishan, and good evening, everyone. I'm happy to be here this evening. First, let me congratulate this initiative. We are living in a knowledge society, and all of us are either knowledge workers or knowledge managers, and we are striving to have high quality education. And whether it is through face to face or through online, there is a lot of debate. But the kind of material that Karwan is now producing, that should serve as the base so that the teacher can build on it. First, let me share some concerns of mine because I am associated with history at the higher level, first as a student, then as a teacher, now almost 54 years. 66 to 68 was my MA, and after that it was my PhD. To situate this talk, first I think I have to share some of my concerns. I said that we are living in a knowledge society and historians are knowledge workers or knowledge managers. So naturally the question arises, what kind of historical knowledge that we produce? Can we identify these forms of knowledge? This has already started by the end of, say, 20th century. I will give you some sample. B.S. Cone was the first to write about colonialism and its forms of knowledge, the British in India. People may be familiar with his work. Then Vasudha Dalmia in 1997, the nationalization of Hindu tradition, Bhartendu Harishchandra and 19th century Banaras. People must be familiar with that work as well. Then A. Michaels edited the Pandit, Traditional Scholarship in India, produced by Manohar. Then you have C.A. Bailey's work that everyone at the MA level must have been using, Empire and Information. It is intelligence gathering and the social communication. And Indra Sengupta and Dawood Ali, this is important, knowledge production, pedagogy and institutions in colonial India. To just reiterate my point that we are moving towards a knowledge society, these are some of the works. Then the second concern is actually what was mentioned in question answer session by Richard Eaton when he recently gave a talk on his book from Aligarh. I mean, it was Ganga Jamni Shared Past. He presented his book there. Two things are very important in his speech. One, the difference that he made between textbooks and monographs. Why textbooks are not popular? Why don't we write textbooks? Because I know that everyone will be having this kind of question in the mind, but monographs, because it was preferred. So textbooks are expected to comprehend the existing knowledge, whereas a monograph is supposed to add to the knowledge. And in one of the answers, when he responded to a question, he said, historian's task is to assess the past in its own terms. People might recall. And even before this, I think I gave the title Buttonstein and a Historian at Work. Partly, I had this in my mind. But when you ask a question about, of course, he is himself going to talk about it. But since I have gone through the work, and so that people could just have some idea, because students are also participating. It is a sequel to Professor Thappar's book of Early India, brought out by Penguin. And Professor Thappar stops with 1300. That is why the normal criticism that we don't find the imperial Cholas or Chalukyas in his book, they can always say, please revert to volume 1. Because that was restructured, 1526 to 1300. Most of it has been taken care by Professor Thapar. But that is not actually the issue. But what are new in his book, that is what is important. He has brought in Kashmir at a very substantial level, and he has talked about identities. He has talked about Rajput identity, he has talked about Sikh identity, he has talked about Maratha identity, he has talked about Muslims in Bengal and Punjab. And I put a question, probably did not get across to him. Why so much of importance to political culture was my question, because that is the trend, that the trend in comprehending existing knowledge. This was started by Catherine Asher and Cynthia Talbot. So the orientation, cultural orientation. So these are things to notice. The important thing I wanted to point out is whether history can be assessed in its own terms. That is what I'm going to address, that issue. Then the third concern that I have are two lectures, or a lecture and a book. C.P. Snow, way back in 1959, delivered the Reed lecture on two cultures. He condemned the British education for over-rewarding humanities, particularly Greek and the Latin, at the expense of science education. It was like a kind of a caution that unless you promote science and technology, you will be left behind. And 60 years later, I've been reading a book by Rob Riemann in his Fight Against This Age. The title of the book is very interesting, Fight Against This Age, on fascism and humanism. He declared that understanding of society should not get limited by the scientific paradigm of proofs, data, theories, and definitions at the expense of humanities and arts. So when you take all this into consideration, certain questions cross our mind or anybody's mind. Where does discipline history stand in this kind of, among various other disciplines? Is it with science or is it with humanities? This is an age-old question. Although Bury declared history is a science, no less and no more. Everyone is familiar with this statement. Why in some universities it is a social science and in others it is humanities? When and how did it become a social science? Role of positivism in history. I think I also heard Professor Thappar's short, you are practicing cultural history, why are you still a positivist? Why don't you become a postmodernist? That is the kind of criticism. So taking all these into consideration, what do we mean by doing history into 21st century? I tried to address this issue in my William Mayer endowment lecture delivered on March 2nd at the Madras University. So I thought all these could be articulated through a formulation, history, theory, and practice, taking some practitioners or a single practitioner and try to situate him. And interestingly, one of my colleagues, younger colleagues, has recently come out with a book on practice of history in India. So I also draw attention to all of my colleagues that this is also getting kind of attention. Now, coming to the practice of history, I thought that I must give some idea to contrast the practice of Bertenstein. I would like to present a familiar practitioner, at least Delhi University people are very, very familiar with this. And for students, I will just recommend one single book so that they can start with that and go for the full understanding of Professor R.S. Sharma's writing. I did not deliberately take Professor Thapar because the practice of Sharmaji and the practice of Bertenstein, they are at loggerheads with each other. That is why the debate, that is why the criticism. And as far as Professor Sharma is concerned, I have been associated with Professor Sharma from 1976 to 2011. So it is both studies and the interactions with Professor Sharma. So any historian writing responds to the trends of the times in which he is writing or researching. So responded to trends in 50s and 60s. And recently, it has been brought to the notice of everybody through a book published by Orient Black Swan. The very title itself is History and Theory, a tribute to Professor R.S. Sharma. So Professor R.S. Sharma, 1975, when he was presiding over the Indian History Congress, opened the speech with a declaration: no theory, no history, no production, no history, no surplus, no history. But this is a very cryptic way of putting the state of the art in 1975, and you in conversation also used to share this. So very idea of making this is that Marxism as a tool of analysis. And then the real takeaway, as he was also a critic of slave, feudal and peasant societies, we have to keep in mind. That means you can use theory, but you bow to the evidence. If it doesn't fit in, then you use the theory for objectivity. That is always the advice that he used to give. So whenever I start some of my old students might just recall, I used to tell them two things. How to understand Sharmaji in 4 or 5 lines. I used to tell the students, decline of trade, decay of urban centers, debasement of coinage, assignment of land in lieu of cash for services, and beginnings of Indian feudalism. Very easily one can comprehend what he was telling, and that's the way that he always was so simple, he will explain. The second thing that people should understand, since I am talking about theory, I also give my student a working social formation if you are using Marxism, and that is a sequence of societies based on specific modes of production, containing within themselves elements of contradiction, leading to a crisis, revolution, and discontinuous change. The first criticism of Sharmaji came when the crisis was missing and Professor B.N.S. Yadav added the social crisis later, Kali crisis. These are all things which is part of the game, I can say. So then, when you agree upon surplus, you also need a mechanism. So they said, no theory, no history, agreed. No production, no history. Subsistence mode, yes. Dominant form of labor, no, it is not visible in our sources. So that is why social surplus is agreed upon. Then the distribution of surplus through Varna, state, trade, town, these are the mechanisms through which it was distributed. Vary of the models. This is what Sharmaji and his criticism later on, I am going to come back, why he criticized Bertenstein, because Bertenstein was using more sociological and anthropological theories and not the Marxist theory or Marxism. So this is how the debates come. I thought I will just mention here. He very clearly mentions a historian should not fall in the sociological claptrap. So in his criticism of segmentary state, then a historian should also explain social change, ancient to medieval, mode of subsistence. He worked out the stages of ancient Indian economy. That is his greatest contribution, I think. And then when it comes to dominant labor, he was not able to find it in sources. And respect the sources, use the theory as a tool. Urban decay thesis, question of periodization, relevance of past to the present, need for an integrated approach. These are all things which goes with the Professor R.S. Sharma. So now coming to the practice of theory, and is it there in our curriculum? Then I would like to recall when I was a student in 68 in the Madras University, there used to be two richly endowed lectures. The one which I got the opportunity after retirement, I was telling about William Mayer. But the philosophy department offered a lecture called the Principal Miller Lecture. So while the accent was more on philosophy of history rather than on theory, that's what I want to convey. Hegel talked about both philosophy of mind as well as philosophy of history. And this Principal Miller Lecture, the theme was always constant. That was meaning of history. So I've heard at least about 10 or 15 philosophers talking about meaning of history in those days. And the most popular book, even now I think it is popular, R.G. Collingwood's The Idea of History, that everyone would know. Then when it comes to MPhil and other classes, and even in Delhi University, I remember teaching in the initial years, not at the MA level, but at the MPhil level, we used to discuss the theory of history. And just to draw the attention of people, those who are interested, G.R. Elton, the title of the book is very important, The Practice of History, 1969. It's not new book, it's an old book. Return to Essentials, 1991. That means that the nature of history is changing and you have to get back to essentials. Then Arthur Marwick's two books, all of them know. That is Nature of History and the New Nature of History. Then J. Tosh, The Pursuit of History. Stanford, The Nature of Historical Knowledge. This was published in 1984. Stanford's book, 1986. Cohen, Historical Culture on the Reading of an Academic Discipline. History Out of Joint, 2006. And Keith Jenkins, Rethinking History at the Limits of History, etc. To this line, you can add Anirudh Deshpande's book, which is easily available now. So the appeal to teachers as well as students is not to neglect this aspect about the nature of discipline, changes, as well as the practice of history, to make history a little more serious in teaching and learning. It is for that I want to appeal. So now I will come to the topic of the day with these kinds of concerns and then these trends. Professor Thapar observed in the case of R.S. Sharma two great contributions. One is expansion of sources, and the second, the analytical method to examine data. These are the two real contributions of Professor R.S. Sharma, according to Professor Thapar, when she wrote the tribute on Professor Sharma's demise, I would like to place 4 such comments about Burtonstein when he died. And those 4, I would like to stick to that in explaining the kind of work that he did. R.I. Moore, he was the general editor of the World History series, of which Burtonstein was writing History of India, which was published posthumously with the help of his wife Dorothy, Sanjay Subramaniam, and Washbrook. So the colleagues and Moore have 4 significant statements about Burtonstein to understand him better. Moore writes, most original and influential historian of 20th century. Most original and influential historian of the 20th century. David Washbrook is belongs to the school of Anil Seal, provincial nationalism, people must be familiar, and didn't consider colonialism as a significant intervention. Interestingly, Eaton also makes the same statement, because he talks about modernity, he goes back to Akbar and Aurangzeb, that he did not come with colonialism. You see, these are some of the ideas that people should think about it. So Burtonstein talked about it even then. And in fact, if you see the book, History of India, you'll say myth of colonization. That is a portion. And then C.J. Fuller writes, saw authority and economics as a source for doing history. Authority and economics as a source for writing history. And C.A. Bailey writes, adopted Marxist politics which sat uneasily with objectified culture. You see, which sat uneasily with objectified culture. So what I want to convey at this stage is that whoever wrote between 1950s and 1990s, and when they use theory, then a descriptive subject like history becomes a social science. So that is what exactly I want to convey. So you have to have a theory, an analytical frame, and the sources have to be analyzed, and the practice is actually that of a social science. And Professor Thapar also, if you see the first volume of Penguin, she gives up to human science and all, and then along with the kind of observation that she made, until critical theory and cultural theory questioned it, it was actually practiced as a social science. So now I would like to give that before going into an analysis, I thought that the listener for the first time should know what exactly was the output of Burtonstein. See, he wrote about 40 papers. I'm not going to give you all, and some important books. I am going to classify. In fact, I have a chronological order in which I have arranged them and I have studied them so that the ideas, how they developed. But for the benefit of the listener, I will just go chronologically mentioning, he first did a PhD in 56, 58 on Tirupati temple. I think people may be aware. So the first official paper that he wrote was the economic function of a South Indian temple in Journal of Asian Studies 1959-60. The second paper that he wrote was the state, the temple and agricultural development, a study in medieval South India in EPW in 1961. Then the third one was integration of the agrarian system of South India in land control and social structure, edited by Robert Frykenberg. Then the fourth important paper was State and the Agrarian Order in Medieval South India. First he presented it in a conference, and then later on it came in the collection of essays on South India in 1975 first, and the Indian publication in 1976. Then comes 1977, the segmentary state in South India, South Indian history, in R.G. Fox, Realm and Region. And then the book, peasant state and society in South India, which everybody knows and everyone is talking about, and everyone reacted to that. It is, as somebody said, it shook the South Indian historian from his slumber and then made him sit straight and then either accept or reject. So both criticisms as well as awe, awe-inspiring it was. Then comes Professor Mukhya also in his lecture mentioned that Bartenstein was the only non-Marxist historian who joined the debate on feudalism. Edited by Byers and Mukhya, Politics, Peasants and Deconstruction of Feudalism. It came in 1985. Then State Formation and Economy Reconsidered in Modern Asian Studies in 85. Then the Segmentary State Interim Reflections came in Pochapada's and the other Stern editor, From Kingship to State, the Political in the Anthropology and History of the Indian World. And Communities, States in Classical India, it came in 1997. This was a posthumous publication, it came out. And then the Blackwell History of the World by R.I. Moore, that also came in 1998. I have something to say on this, so I will come back to that. Then he did not stop with Cholas, but today I will confine myself to Cholas for want of time. I'm not going into Vijayanagar. I mentioned it in my last lecture also. So temples in Tamil country, 1300 to 1700, Mahanavami, the festival, kingly ritual, all the king's mana, Vijayanagara and the transition to patrimonial system. Again, this is another controversial this thing of patrimonial system. Reapproaching Vijayanagara, the New Cambridge History, that is a book, Patronage and Vijayanagara, Religious Foundations, Powers of Art, Barbara Stoller Miller. And then finally, he also wrote on Thomas Munro, The Origins of Colonial State and Vision of Empire. Now, what I want to discuss is, I had several opportunities. I think I wish to record. Some of my old colleagues would realize this. It so happened we were working in the archives at the same time, Madras archives. I had joined in 68, 69. So it so happened next table, and then we used to have evening coffee together. And then he was always in a khaki pant and a white shirt and smoking a bidi, not even cigarette. Ultimately, he died of throat cancer, unfortunately. So we had several occasions to discuss things. And then I was also working on partly early modern period at that time. So Burt's beliefs, first I would like to list. Physical setting influences the shaping of local societies. This idea, if anyone wants to read it fully, you have to only take Cambridge Economic History Volume 1, that piece on South India. He would have discussed about ecotypes, etc. Some of my students, we have already, they must be familiar with it. Then the posthumous publication, which I mentioned, that is, what do you call, Communities and States. In fact, this is actually the formulation of Professor Bartenstein. That is, relationship between communities and states as primary entities. Then the third aspect is the relational aspect between the two entities. Then the fourth aspect, which he has mentioned in the book, and this was actually his scheme, but when the book came out, I don't know, it came as ancient, medieval and modern. Probably if he had completed, it would have been like this. It is very, very interesting to note this scheme. It is from page 21 to 34 in that textbook he has written on History of India. Communities without states. Communities as states, great communities. Communities and states without communities. So he has avoided that state formation, this and all that in his scheme like this. Communities without states, 7000 BC to 800 BC. Communities as states, great communities from 800 BC to 300 AD. Communities and states 300 AD to 1750. States without communities. In fact, he uses a very strong expression, decorticated shelves of ideology. Remove the cerebral cortex. That is the name, benefit of that. So now the working definition of Bertenstein, of course, it is not his formulation, my understanding, so that I can make that distinction. Although he has mentioned it in one of the papers, which I could not locate, maybe I will go through it and tell you, his definition of social formation, to be contrasted with the Marxian working definition I gave a little while ago, is about people, here not sequence of societies, the change, who share material interests, which they manage politically, not appropriating surplus. So that becomes a criticism of Professor Sharmaji later. I'll come back to that also. And preserve over time through cultural forms, which could be perceived as ideologies. I repeat, a working definition for understanding Bertenstein, it is not his formulation. Social formation is about people who share material interests, which they manage politically and preserve over time through cultural forms, which could be perceived as ideologies. So let me try to explain the meaning of this a little bit. People here, it could be community, it could be society, so that all his sociological theories could be applied. So I was inspired by this, and I wrote a book where there were no takers, because I was not writing on the dominant historiography. The title of my book is Societas to Civitas, the Evolution of Political Society. I used Morgan and I applied it to Sangam literature. Then for a king, initially he used to give a very interesting definition. Who is a South Indian king? His retort will be very, very interesting. A ritualized political manager of agrarian resources. Who is a South Indian king? A ritualized political manager of agrarian resources. But later on, he rejected the managerial state. He simply said he was a chief manager. And then what is a prasad? His answer was very, very interesting. That is, it is a symbol of redistributive economy at work. It's a symbol of redistributive economy at work. So the state was a managerial apparatus. Cultural forms were ritual, Brahman, Bhakti, all these are the cultural forms. Ideology, Brahman, Bhakti, etc. I think that makes it clear. So if we understand it this way, then it will make sense. It's here that I would like to share one more interesting comment that Professor R.S. Sharma made to Dr. Vivekanand Jha, the editor of IHR, when Bertenstein died. Where we were all having a cup of tea in Professor Dr. Jha's house. Vivekanandji asked Sharmaji who should write the obituary of Bertenstein IHR. Sharmaji waited for a moment and then made a comment. All of us have criticized him a lot. The only sympathizer in our lot is Venkat, let him write. In a jocular way. So ultimately, I wrote the obituary and that was published. So now, having given an idea about his beliefs and then the meaning of a working definition, let me give an idea about the approach. His approach as a historian was step one, assess the state of art on a theme. Step two, chart the historiographical shifts. Step 3, rethink old problems, open up questions which were considered closed. Step 4, locate a theme within wider historiographical debates, say feudalism. Step 5, autonomy and relate. See, it is here that the theory he used to say Marxist theory itself, it's what he was the first to draw my attention as a student. I was just 23, 24, sitting next to him, talking to him. He said that the neo-Marxist writing, he drew my attention and said, you know, that superstructures, autonomy and relative autonomy of superstructures and mediation among superstructures, all this I came to know from him. So that is why I am saying that the idea of a political culture itself is possible only when superstructure interact with each other. Otherwise, no. So this is the kind of a theoretical nuance I thought I would share with you what I learned from him. And then step 6, role of liberal historiography, anthropology and sociology investigating state formation, the relation between pre-modern states and kinship, legitimation of state power through patterns of religious and cultural practices, etc. So these are the ideas with which he wanted to test all this pre-colonial India. It was his testing ground. So that is why he raised questions on forms of statehood, ritual overlordship, military fiefdoms, complex and relatively centralized empires, So he had this notion, and then finally only he declared it as segmentary. Initially, he did not have basic models of Indian state forms. After studying all that, he said it is not centralized, it is segmentary, and patrimonial was a later addition. So it is this stance that brought debates on ideological discourses and patterns of production into the study of nature of state in India. So now, because the time is very limited, I thought that I will apply his ideas to Chola state, what he said, what he wrote, and how people responded for students to understand slightly. This I am addressing it for students. So he chose the Chola state. The Chola state was segmentary in two ways for him. To start with, central authority does not have responsibility for local divisions. The central authority, not that they were not divided that way, but they do not have any authority or responsibility for local divisions. He fine-tuned it. And then the second, local political institutions are based on a segmentary lineage system. So that is where he erred, which was corrected later by Professor Subbarayalu. The Nadus, if you take it as a kind of a lineage, kind of a contiguity, this thing, it changes over a period of time. I will come to the criticism a little later, otherwise it will get confused. Because the 1977, only he refined it. Central authority and regional kin group interweave to form a state wherein kinship organizes the local administration. So the crucial question is revenue or surplus, if it is that. Let us not use the word surplus for Buttonstein. Even if it is revenue, transfer from autonomous nuclear areas to the royal center, it is not shown in any of the sources. And fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know, with all the kind of empirical response, this is still hazy. How it was transferred, the mechanism is not there in inscriptions also. We'll come back to that a little later. So there was very little transfer, and major income came from two sources. Looting. That is why his student Spencer wrote on politics of plunder. And the nuclear area as center of power up to 13th century. Then in the agrarian system, he said there are three episodes. Integration of agrarian system. Of course, that concept also we have to understand slightly differently is usage. Nadu to Nayaka and Nayaka to Zamindari. So now comes Professor R. Subbarayalu's work. Very path-breaking work. It was an MLit thesis only. Political Geography of the Cholas in 1973. So he made use of this work and made Nadu the important part of Chola administration. Then comes the peasant state and society, where he elaborated the concept there. So now the ideas of Buttonstein on Chola state are the following. Number one, alternative historiographical interpretation of political organization in South India. That is his claim. Conventional historiography fails to demonstrate the manner in which the state is related to social arrangements and cultural features. 3. Localized peasant agriculture based on minor irrigation works in most cases. Artisanal production and trade are integral to peasant agrarian economy. 4. Urbanization, very minor, except perhaps religious activities. So Professor Champak Lakshmi came out with a very strong reply to this underplay of urbanization through her trade ideology and urbanization. 5. Medieval Indian states were custodial, tributary, locally based, and oriented to rural networks. 6. Indian king was an overlord, not a manager, claimed submission to his superiority and not obedience to his orders. So he made fine-tuning. Then there was no separate department of irrigation, right? There is no separate department of irrigation. State was not managerial one. There was little or extra local agencies to manage. See, large-scale irrigation works like China or Mesopotamia is not known, and we should also keep in mind smaller resource base when compared to Gangetic Plain. When we make these comparisons, you know, the regional history, pan-Indian problems, regional historians we face. There is neither convincing evidence of officials involved with taxes nor particular payments to the state. Here, Subrayulu has given a very good answer of the kind of officials who were involved in collecting. Denies primacy to village, but the primacy is given to Nadu. So that is for you, Bertenstein's position on Chola state. And I am not going to go into his scheme, but I will straight away go into the main chapter, which that is chapter 7 in his peasant state and society in South India. And then I will go to the criticism. Chola king is seen as executive over a vast and powerful bureaucracy, Byzantine. That is the description of Nilkant Shastri. And Kadamai as land tax, and Kudimai as duties of Kudis. There is always debate on Chola revenue. So there was how much of land tax, how it was paid, who collected, that becomes a problematic area. Debate on nature of state, ritually incorporated kingship, because the Kshatriya Rajadharma, he has drawn heavily from sociologists, Gonda, Hokart, Hopkins, Lingat, etc. So pyramidally segmentary state and sacral kingship. So I would like to quote Bertenstein himself in page 281. It is only as these formulations of pyramidal segmentation and sacral kingship are brought together that a single cogent model of state formation and statecraft can be realized. Another problem is chieftains. So if you see the first volume, first issue of IHR, there is an article by one Richard Kennedy, South Indian king as chieftain and emperor. For some time he will be a chieftain, for some time he will be an emperor. That is the kind of discussion. So chieftains, just as kings possessed, also had all the attributes of Kshatriya and Rajadharma according to Bertenstein. So Chola Mandalam was the central zone. Naduvil Nadu, Tonda Mandalam and Pandi Mandalam were intermediate zones. Kungu and Gangavadi were peripheral zones. So I was inspired to write chiefdom to state as my presidential address in the central Mandalam only. So now the third aspect is very important. Why such a big temple? Because people who were writing in 80s, 90s, 70s, 80s, 90s, there were three things which engaged them. One was monumentality. The second was state making. And the third one was social relationships. And Bertenstein was no exception to address these three issues. That is why the monumentality part, particularly the big temple, the purpose of the big temple, incorporation of local place and caste tutelary deities was the form of ritual sovereignty he was talking about. religious policies should not be understood as arising from economic purposes. So it is the difference. So then Sharmaji will criticize him for overemphasizing ritualism, economy versus ritualism. This is how the nuances have to be understood. But as a political design to encompass independent and localized cultic affinities within an expanding Chola hegemony, page 331. Construction of the big temple, recruitment of staff, provision of income, preparation of prasastis, amekirtis, all are definitely tendencies on centralization. God king perception, he compares it with Devaraja cult. It is an idiom of a dharmic universe realized through sacral kingship and technical bureaucratic. So now, this kind of an explanation of an Indian, South Indian state, do you think that it will be accepted easily? So it was criticized at the theoretical level, and it was also challenged at the empirical level. I think this is the part which I think students have to be really careful and read the book and understand. Professor Romila Thapar has not criticized Bertenstein anywhere, no criticism. In the sense that her students have criticized. Keshavan has criticized, Sampagalakshmi has criticized, or Rajan Gurukul has criticized. But only senior historian to respond to his theory was Professor R.S. Sharma. Because I was there in the discussion, I can tell you, these are the points on which Sharmaji criticized. Number one, elevation of ritualism over economic and political processes. It cannot be. It is wrong. Number two, the missing mechanism of surplus extraction. He did not agree with the managerial role of our custodial state. And third, Alur was not a state, but a pre-state. Number four, temples. Professor Jha has written temples as landed magnets and sub-infeudation. And then segmentary state does not help in differentiating social formation. So naturally, these are the criticisms that are expected of Professor R. Sharma. And finally, he writes that we should not fall into the claptrap, sociological claptrap. But now the substantial reply has come only from the team, initially from Professor Subbarayalu and then from Karashima. All this you can see in that the concise history of South India, 2014 OUP publication. It comprehends all ideas of the team. So now what are the major areas of criticism? One, he doesn't take into account disappearance of a tribal society and the emergence of a stratified society. Number two, breakdown of communal property and feudalization of land relations, and they have demonstrated it through inscriptions. Centralization of kingly power, bureaucracy, and standing army, they have attempted, but still, standing army, there is no positive evidence of a standing army. There's still, that is the area, a gray area. Ethnic coherence of Nadu is wrong. Nadu changed over time. Subbarayalu has demonstrated that. Right hand and left hand divisions arise only after 12th century. You don't hear about them before 12th century. YS quantified. See, he quantified the revenue as a notional claim of 87,000 metric tons of paddy per annum through land tax. He has quantified that in his book. Standing army question still awaits unsatisfactory answer. So now, I think in another 3 or 4 minutes, I would like to wind up this presentation by what a student of history or a person should understand in this kind of indulgence is how to evaluate. I think in your this thing, you have not given his birth date. You have given 26/4 as the date of his death, but he was born on 1st August 1926. So 56 to 96, he joined as research student as 56, 40 years of active intellectual life. and he has written so many things we have seen. So now, a historian's mind, they will ask questions. This, what is history? He also asked. History today, he also tried to explain. I mean, in conversations, although he has not written like Arthur Marwick or anybody, understanding history, I gave you examples of what kind of replies he would give. Ritualized political manager and Prasad as a redistributive economy and all that. So, what I have to take from these kinds of replies is, it is not E.H. Carr's privilege. Every generation has got the privilege to ask the question, what is history? Every generation has been asking. And then, and the underlying question is how humanity began and how we arrived at the present. So in the explanation, people may differ. And in 1960s particularly, I'm repeating him, world is facing a common future and should have a common history. So that is why that project also, this thing, the Steen or Eaton. And Eaton is answering in a different way. That is interactive world. It is not alone. It is not that we are alone. Anything developed, it is all through interactions. So this is one thing that we have to remember. He was a product of his times. Second, neoclassical economics, sociology, semiotic conception of culture influenced him. But no other historian has systematically applied it. And in his this thing, culture according to anthropology and its meeting with political economy. So that is exactly what Bailey or someone observed. I have quoted him. Then when it comes to question of writing history, we are doing something, as in his own words, he has written in that book also, a historian does what is called selective compression of time. Second, historian of the present in the past. This is what is important. Historian of the present in the past, in the sense that he uses the present day tools to analyze the past. It is in that. So when you do that, distortion of time is inevitable. Distortion of time is inevitable, and subjectivity has to be kept to the minimum. So that is why past has to be assessed on its terms, I mentioned earlier also. Then the third problem he used to discuss is uneven proportions of historical evidence brings in the selective factor. Uneven. So that's why we can only select. Here I think he was agreeing with Carr. But Carr was talking about facts, Bertenstein was talking about evidence. Then fourth, the selective factor at work has much to do with the interests and knowledge of historians within each time period, with their ideas of what at each point in each time is significant for developments that subsequently took place. So I would like to end this presentation with what are historians? Why are they so difficult to deal with it? They not only add a pinch of salt, sometimes we add a ton of salt. So historians are all doubting Thomases. So Bertenstein also doubted. What is that doubt? Whether the Indian people can be said to have had the institutional base upon which modern states and societies can be formed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for this wonderful presentation. It was thoroughly, a learning experience for all of us to learn about different historians, especially R.S. Sharma, and who was a great historian from the Department of History of our university, and then Professor Burton Steen as well. So, sir, how do you see the history writing in present times when you said the past should not be seen from the present lens, because with that distortion of the past is for sure. So how do you see the present trends of history writing, and do you see it is good, or do you think there some changes are required in the way history is being perceived in today's time?
See, this is a very broad question. This could be fine-tuned by saying what is good history and what is bad history? Okay, what is good history and what is bad history? How do we judge that a work is sound? How do you judge that a work is not good, uh, etc.? That is the kind of uh, answer we have to give. Fortunately, we are all living in a, I mean, at least I am fortunate after moving into Delhi to come into people like Professor R. S. Sharma. And I don't know whether people know that we stayed in the same tower complex. So I could spend at least a lot of time with him discussing. And whenever we met, he used to ask the question, what are you working? No other. First question will be, are you working on what? Can we discuss? So he lived up to 90. He fine-tuned. And what one aspect I forgot to add about Sharmaji was the element of what I call see, when we take relevance of the past to the present, it is where we have to take Professor Sharma and Professor Thapar as two models. Because Sharmaji was forthright in making this comment, fight against communalism and obscurantism. He stood for it. And that is probably because of uninitiated kind of this thing, wrongly understood those kinds of things. So the last point, the question of periodization, after that I must have mentioned relevance of past to the present. So now uninitiated ones, they do it, but Professor Thapar has done it. I mean, now that you have given me an opportunity, I will talk about Professor Thapar also. She has also developed it. They worked under the same supervisor, that is A.L. Basham, almost around the same time, maybe 5-6 years difference only. But the way that they are interpreting the past, they are totally different. It is only for the benefit of students, I am telling. Openly, they have not been criticizing. If you read that Interpreting Early India, that small book, and particularly that early history and overview, the very first idea of Professor Thapar is the nomenclature early medieval does little towards either explaining itself or the subsequent medieval period. That is why she is using early India. So there is no mention of early medieval India. She has her reasons for that. They are reasoning out. So what is important is the rationalization of thought and its application. Use of methods, sources, interpretation, all these things come. So differentiation between pre-Gupta and post-Gupta is necessary. And Harappan society is still enigmatic. These are all her statements. I'm just summarizing that for others, how they differ. Vedic society has been described as tribal. Otherwise, why should she write lineage to state? Otherwise, why should I write evolution of political society? So there is no point in glorifying a society which was tribal. If it is tribal, it was tribal. Because when you talk about tribes, it is tribal. Then she is also not uncomfortable with the peasant economy. Applied to which Gahapati, the crucial question is tax, which is missing in Vedic sources. So she is talking about forms of exchange. It is crucial. So like that, why I am giving this contrast is each one's perception of the past had its own reasons and its own explanation. So that use of the past uncritically to the present is what historians are criticizing. That is the only answer that I can give. That serious historians, they have problems. It is not intolerance. Again, I want to record. It is, we are not convinced about understanding the past in a certain way. If there can be differences between historians, it could be differences between uninitiated ones and people who are highly evolved. That is the only reply I can give.
Thank you so much sir, for that wonderful explanation. I think that is very important to understand for every student of history when there are different ways of looking at the past, and we have to be very analytical about all those uh, ways of approaching history. So, how do you see history teaching in university level and at the school level and even at the research level in today's time and when you were teaching at Delhi University or at the Madras University?
See, as I told you, each generation has got its own questions about the past, and see how the past is relevant to the present. That every generation has to ask that question. But what has happened now or in the last say 20 or 30 years is, it is not the generation which is asking the question. Each individual is asking, how is it related to me? Because of identity and identity politics. In a way, I would like to say, now the question of what is history has become, who is history for? Are you talking to a Tamilian? Are you talking to a Punjabi? Are you talking to a Bihar? What is history to me? Now it has become, who is history for? This is a major change, which I think Arthur Marwick has also said. See, it is here that change, that questioning, that question to Professor Thapar, somebody put positivism. And she says rational explanation is what historian is trying to do. I am trying to reason out that these are the problems of the past. If you bring the past to the present, then these problems will create further problems like this. Here, I would like to share with you one more thing. I happened to be in Russia when Putin was taking over, and a question was put to him and Professor Ramakant Agnihotri of my linguistics department. We were both there. One important statement, it is etched in my mind. Those who want to forget the past do not have a heart. Those who want to bring back the past do not have a head. These are words of Putin. Okay, the role of the historian is to reason out, rationalization. History is completely rationalistic. You use a theory, you don't use a theory, use the evidence properly, assess the past, allow the past to have a dialogue with the present, etc. All those things are historians' this thing. So, the rationalization, if it is not there, reasoning, if it is not there, then that kind of unreasoned this thing is not acceptable to historian. That is why I ended my statement saying historians are all doubting Thomases. We would like to find an answer, proper answer, and we try to reason out. So if you want to defeat a historian, you have to beat him on his logic.
Sir, if I were to ask you this question, I think you have already answered it at various junctures in your presentation. What is your idea of history, and what is history mean to you? How do you approach history while you write books and while you teach?
You see, thing is, if you ask me that question, I try to tell you that I was trained by very, very conventional historians. Until I came into History Congress 1975, which I could not attend, but 1976 at Calicut, Professor Sharmaji's address proceedings was distributed. I opened the general president's address. I saw no theory, no history. So when I had idea of coming to universities, I started preparing myself on theory, which I was not equipped till then. We were trained more on the philosophy of history rather than on the theory of history. So each state curriculum or anything, but our teachers, particularly I worked under Professor Mahalingam, who was the first to write on administration and social life under Vijayanagar. So, and all that. So, empirical history is what we were trained. But interpretative history, we got exposure only when we came here. But even that has gone several stages. Say, for example, industrial society, post-industrial society, questions of modernity, the kind of questions either Eaton or Bertenstein was asking was modernity, isn't it? So modernity has different aspects of it. So now we talk about a cultural turn, we talk about a linguistic turn, we talk about postmodernism, although it has not impacted Indian history writing much. Professor Sumit Sarkar was the first to give a lecture in 98 at St. Stephen's College on postmodernism and the writing of history. Okay, so it takes time for us to catch up with these things. So if you take knowledge society as a social formation, we may have to wait for another 10 years to talk about it. By then the society would have changed into something else. So what is relevant? What is culture? What is cultural history? See, we are now using cultural production. For the first time in a textbook, Eaton has used that expression cultural production. Where does it come from? It came from Marxism only. Theodor Adorno, within the Frankfurt kind of a thing. Say culture, cultural production, culture can enter market relations. It can also be reproduced. Tapes, it could be reproduced. CDs. In fact, jocularly, I used to tell my music people, if you ask me, how are you? What are the teaching learning methods? I used to say, Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Devo Maheswaraha, you start. Then it became Guru Tepo Maheswaraha. Then it became Guru CDO Maheswaraha. Then it became Guru MP3O Maheswaraha. A little bit of Sakshatkar has come through Skype. So technology and learning and thinking, whether postmodernism will affect this history writing or not, consciously or unconsciously, it will affect some areas. Definitely it is affecting. Without knowing that it is, literature people are more conscious about it. Historians are little late about it. Sociologists are very quick to talk about the change in society. They talk about a risk society. They talk about an information society. They talk about a knowledge society. Historians are little late. That is probably because we depend on evidence. And I believe, since I'm answering your question, I take Professor Sharmaji's advice seriously. If you are not using the sources, historian will lose his identity.
Yeah, those were some very powerful words to
Powerful
memorize
words.
for all the
He
students.
did not compromise. He did not compromise. Although he followed Marxism, he said there is
Yes,
no slavery. It's not a dominant form of labor in our sources. He was quite clear.
yes. So there's a question from Sukhdev Sohal on Facebook that do you find influence of the Annals School on Burton Steen, especially of Fernand Braudel?
Um, I don't think I have read all his writings. He has been influenced, as I told you, on neo-colonial economics, yes. Semiology, culture, more of anthropology. When it comes to culture, it is more of anthropology. You see all his writings, but not Braudel or Annales School. I have not come across that.
So this is a question from Balambam Ramaswamy, and his question is: do you support the theory of um Burtonstein on the, on the theory of state? Burtonstein and uh, I think I cannot read the name, but Burtonstein theory
Segmental
of
state.
state. Yes.
Segmental
Do you
state.
support? Yes, yes.
No, I don't.
I think this is Noboru Karashima and Burtonstein's.
Yeah, no. I am replying. See, it is not. She is Dr. Balambal. She is much senior to me. She was my senior research student. I am very happy that she has joined. And I am taking Burtonstein's intervention as a major intervention in raising questions which epigraphists, empirical answers have been found for most of it. So that's the way I think history should progress. A very healthy debate and a very good response from Subrayulu and this thing. It cannot be accepted as segment restrict. I don't subscribe to that. But questions were valid.
Yes, sir. So, what is the legacy of Burtonstein that students of history and even the teachers should learn and even take it forward?
No, I think I I tried to give an evaluation towards the end of my this thing. I said historian of the present in the past. I mentioned one. Okay, which means to him, you use present day tools to analyze the past, not necessarily backward projection of the present to the past. That he was very, very clear. So, as you used to say, he started working on Inam. Have you heard about the name lands, Inam lands? Inam.
Yes,
There
sir.
are 9 types of Inams. About 44% of the land was under Inam. It was only giving 7% of revenue in beginnings of 19th century. But to abolish that, it took 1950. So ancient privileges continued. Okay, so that is why he said he started having questions of the present, then started working towards the past, and in the process made it interdisciplinary. In the process applied, he tried to theorize also. So that theorization part was a very bold attempt which will attract criticism. But the questions that he raised, I did not go into Vijayanagara, for example. I think probably I mentioned it in the last lecture somewhere else. The rethinking or reapproaching Vijayanagara, he wrote the kind of questions that he asked. What is the linkage between city and the empire? And society was on the move, the kind of things that they are all questions of Burtonstein. So he had a questioning mind. He tried to theorize it. He raised a lot of questions, which engaged serious researchers like Noburu Karashima and Subrayulu. They found partial answers to some of them. Some of them are yet to be answered, like Standing Army. We don't have this thing. So it is a beautiful world. Debate is always a very beautiful world, and intellectually it is stimulating.
So, sir, to end this beautiful evening, my question to you is: in the so-called quote unquote mainstream history, we often neglect some topics, some themes like the history of science, history of music, and now that you are working on the history of music and percussion art, do you think more such themes should be approached by history students in the present times and in times to come?
Yeah, here, people may agree with me, may not agree with me. The way historiography has progressed in India. I think I mentioned it in the last lecture also. When I joined Delhi University, I was to revise courses and all. See, what has been the problem here was it was all in political and economic framework. Even socio-economic history was an appendage of economic history. There was no social history. So I tried to bring in Burtonstein's ideas of theories, etc. I had a social structure of each region and all that. So unless you have a proper social history, you will not have a reinterpretative culture history. But actually, culture has become very, very important. Culture has become very, very important. Interestingly, I forgot to tell you one thing. 1984, Professor J.S. Grewal jocularly added to these three: no product, no theory, no history; no production, no history; no surplus, no history; no culture, no history. So it was added. So there was a cultural turn. There was a linguistic turn. So now, problem of music. You raised about music. that music, it is it is a kind of reception. We have received it, so we have to study the treatises. Present day practices should not be imagined that it was done there. So if you have a tribal society, you have to have instruments. What was the limitations of music? It has to be whatever information that is available. So the historical rigor should not be diluted. So maybe another occasion I will try to construct a musical tradition of Tanjore. How to interpret it? It's very difficult to explain, but there was no scope of teaching all that in history, at least when I was in service.
So, sir, do you think it should be encouraged in history universities and
Yes,
colleges?
I think Dr. Anirudh Deshpande has made that plea. I have seen that book also. For example, cinema. Was it there earlier? No. So once you have culture, automatically these things will come. And
Yes,
but
sir.
music is very difficult to teach. You have to be a musician and a historian. There has to be a combination.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir, for taking out so much time to interact with students and to share some really great anecdotes from your career and especially from the career of Buttonstein and R.S. Sharma. It was truly an enlightening session, and I hope everybody is enriched with your thoughts and they will research more in history and they will take this discipline forward in future. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us live this evening. This video will be available on the YouTube channel. So anybody who wish to watch it later on can go to our YouTube channel and watch it there. Thank you so much and have a good evening.
Thank you very much for giving this opportunity.